back up and talk about your own trajectory as a young person, going into international diplomacy, and even earlier than that, what are some early experiences that you had that helped develop your value system?
Well, I was trouble right from the start. Never chose a path of diplomacy. I'm not just a national development practitioner, but always looking to deliver, to see an injustice and remove those injustices, recognizing very early on one could not do it injustice by injustice, but you really needed a system to do it. I think, coming from a family where both my parents were in the service business, one was a nurse and the other a veterinary surgeon, so from human beings to animals, they were all around us. Then there were 5 girls in northern Nigeria, which was very conservative, and no boys in our family. So, my father was there, thought not to have any leadership in his family, so we were always pushed to try to do the best that we could and be better. Of course, we still believe we were better than the boys. But I think Nigeria was really amazing for me, training ground. First of all, the strong sense of community that we had, and that, along the way, the value system that we had cared about people. I always say that I did as I had children, or as we had many traumas that we all lived through. In my country, we bore evidence to bearing giving birth to Boko Haram, a terrorist organization. But faith was important. I would say that I never needed a shrink. It was my grandmother or my aunt or my uncle. Our communities were strong, and I think that always was something that you could fall back on. So failure itself was a lesson. I mean, you just picked yourself up and on you went, and you always knew someone had your back. So I think early on, not to underestimate the power of family and community and faith and the things that perhaps you will take for granted, or as you have developed, you've lost. Don't lose them, they're really, really important. And then as I went on, I was lucky to be in jobs where we designed so many schools and universities, hospitals, but in the country there was never the resources to actually make them work for people. So there were these schools that were built that either the teachers were not there, and if they read it were not good enough, or the classes were overcrowded, and we were suddenly thinking about, well, how do you actually deal with this? And this meant policy and government, and to begin with, my sort of angst about the education system being so bad in my country, fighting for that in civil society. And I left the private sector, by the way, to go into civil society to fight government, and then they sort of said to you, well, could you just keep your voice down and come in and help us to do this? And that was a big risk. Not many people would go into government there for fear of being absorbed, assimilated. So you try to keep one leg out or arm, hanging on to civil society with your life, and staying in a government where it took a long time to try to get our education system at least more coherent in a federal way. And you just keep delivering. I mean, I've always said that is the more you deliver, the more needs to be done. And I think that's just keep your eyes focused on delivering for people. I think that's always mattered in our family, is that it's not okay until everybody's okay.
What a great slogan. It's not okay until everyone's okay. Tell me, you held a number of different positions within the Nigerian government, and then you went on to the United Nations. And I'm interested in that transition. What did you learn in national government that was absolutely cognizable at the international level, and what was a surprise?
Well, again, good training ground, because in managing the position I had in government, very many different positions, a government that perhaps had weaker institutions than what I find now, but also gave me a sense of what it was to have a parliament in place that you have to convince. So the mirror I had from national government to the UN when I went, and the UN was never on my career path agenda. It just came by mistake. But it never was. It was about me doing the work at home and then being asked by the Secretary General, "Can you come and help us do this?" So getting into the UN was a bit of a shock. It was, as I saw the three levels, I saw very much one over the years. And that made it very difficult. So when you say the UN, what do you mean? The Secretary General, the Secretariat, the 42 funds, programs and agencies, all of which have a board that run themselves. So I think that was the biggest shock, was that the Secretary General was the Secretary and not the General. So he would say jump, you don't say how high, you move to the left, to the right, whereas my president, you say jump, you would say how high. So big differences in accountability, in navigating the power structures and the system that you needed to get to behind some of the actions that have to be taken.
I'd like to turn to the goals, the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which are, if you haven't read them, you should read them. They are expansive, ambitious, and critically important. And they're articulated in a measurable set of 169 specific targets. They run the gamut from the first Sustainable Development Goal. First is end poverty in all forms everywhere. That's the first goal. No pressure. Yeah. And then it goes from that to one of the later goals is protect, restore, and promote sustainable use of terrestrial ecosystems, sustainably manage forests, combat desertification, and halt and reverse land degradation and biodiversity loss. Wow. And each one of these is incredibly ambitious, important, and has a series of very specific targets. Economic, social, financial, environmental. And the UN has been working on these goals for almost a decade. How do you measure progress? You talked in your remarks at the beginning of being disappointed, or implicitly, you're disappointed that there hasn't been as much progress as all of us would like. How do you think about progress and the road ahead to 2030?
First things first, these goals, Sustainable Development, was first spoken to in 1990. It took us till 2015 to have a set of goals that represented what was the whole of development as a paradigm shift from just doing the social pillar to all of it. And the big question was, why not all of it? Why for some parts of the world would you consider the economy important and not in others? And how do you think you would get ever child mortality down if you didn't have a good health system? So it took us 4 years to get this set of goals, and I set 17, and then you thought, why don't you have 8 or 6 or even something that looks normal? And everybody would say, well, right now this is the response the world needs. This is really representing what people are asking for. And if they want to look at the goals and own them, this is what we need. And I think that the trouble we had in the UN was the international system had put everyone into silos in everything. Whether it was business or government or NGOs, we were all working in silos for children, for poverty, for water. To break out of those silos into a sustainable development paradigm that asks you to look at these 3 strands in a response to a challenge or finding the solutions was incredibly difficult. A, because your whole system and your mind needed to be rewired for this. You really did need to have the capacities and skills to do that. And second, the financial system didn't work with sustainable development. Donors did not work in that way. They were used to either do health and health alone and not a health system. I run a number of hospitals or sexual reproductive health products in each hospital. So it was not a holistic response to that. And that's what we've been grappling with in trying to get that done over these last few years. It has been exacerbated, not off track because we were on track, we were never on track, but it was exacerbated by COVID. Many countries could not recover their systems, their governments. Some countries are printing money, others are not. and that was important. Then we had Ukraine, and the war in Ukraine just showed us how connected we were. That food systems and energy security became a big issue for everyone, miles away, where you never would think that this would have impact. And then we had, very difficult situations when the war in Gaza broke out. Then suddenly it was about different sides of the aisle, and there was a lot of polarization around that. And that did affect the way people manage the economies and the access to resources, access to many things. So there have been lots of exacerbating, moments, and that set the SDGs back. Still think it can be done. Maybe not all of it by 2030, but we don't have the luxury of saying we're not going to make the best of it. Who are you going to leave behind when you say that? So you go for it and you improve all the time and get closer to it. But it is an agenda of scale, and that's difficult to do as well. Perhaps at the best of new scale of India, China, but you have to get to billions. This is not about a few thousand people. This is millions. It requires systems to be funded. It requires an international financial architecture. It's just not right anymore. We need long-term, concessional financing for development. And that, is extraordinary that we recognize that in 1945, when that kind of financing went to countries to rebuild themselves after the war. In fact, a couple of those countries only just finished paying a few years ago, so that's not long-term concessional. And what is? We need it for today, for the rest of the world, so that it is more equal. We know the power dynamics, and everyone knows that you just don't give away power, but it needs to be a more equal world so that power actually survives. The world that we have today is not surviving very well, and it's getting smaller in terms of those who think they're going to survive, but actually get everyone.
I'm just thinking about your work to garner the kind of agreement and support for the Sustainable Development Goals, and how you must have been so excited and proud when you got to that agreement, to that investment, and the clear articulation of these goals. And I've got to think that it's a struggle to continue to have that inspired vision every year when you measure progress, because the targets are measurable. How do you make sense of that in your own life? I mean, this is a driving force in your life. It's a driving force in the United Nations. It's critically important for humanity around the world.
I carry a sense of a lot of frustration and anger, especially where I see things could happen and they don't. But I kind of channel that into getting up every day and looking for the next battle that I need to fight and to get over. And to bring as many people along in that battle to try to get it done. And it doesn't matter if it's a country. And, every time you go out to a country where there is a lot of suffering, the kind of experience that you bring or exposure that you bring with yourself, you find solutions really quickly. But it's to bring the partnerships together to try to get them done. And if there's any frustration, it is that it takes so little to try to get so much done, and we don't do it. If I look at the kind of resources that are spent on war machines that we have, and the fraction that is needed to develop economies, and it's not that every government is sitting there just waiting for money to do the right thing. There are many governments who do have resources and don't do the right thing. But it is about finding community, finding democracy, holding and delivering to people, governance and strong institutions, partnerships, the private sector. There's a whole lot of things that need to happen, and different people that need to be brought to the table. I was lucky to go back to Nigeria after I finished the SDGs, and I was sort of, put into a sector that I had never had any experience in, which was environment. At a time when the Paris Agreement was being tackled. So I didn't know what it was about that we were aiming for in terms of the vision. But the big shock treatment was to land in an institution where there was no idea what climate change and action should be, or that we had a triple planetary crisis of pollution and of the biodiversity. This was a ministry that over the years just dealt with sanitation. And so for all intents and purposes, I was going to be a dustbin lady. And so it was, going in there and trying to turn that system around to do something took a couple of years, and going into a cabinet where my colleagues would say to me, what were you doing with the stock exchange? And I was saying, I'm just, we're getting the first domestic green bond because we need this for climate change. And they were like, wow, so this is what environment's about. So even those that you thought knew about it, didn't. And I think that, never taking for granted that everyone knows, trying as much as possible to get away from the acronyms, to explain what it really means when you say the SDGs.
Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah, the sustainable DSG, and sometimes people get that mixed up, but it is important to, I always say, look at the 17 goals, take the middle out of it, the goals 7 to 15, because they're all investment spaces, investing in clean energy, in cities, and infrastructure. And if it is an inclusive economy, you will pay for the first 6 goals that you should never have to borrow for, because they're basic rights, poverty and sanitation, women's issues, healthcare, education. And all of these have to take the context of the environment, and that's why you see environment goals. But then none of this will stand up if you don't have the institutions. Institutions are incredibly important. Today, 75 years down the road, many are losing their shelf life, and they do need a reset. That needs a lot of courage to get up and say, well, how do we do that? And it needs to feel more, not less, that you're having that transformation. And then finally, the partnerships. Ask the partnerships within your institutions, because I'm pretty sure even in this institution, across the departments, there are struggles.
Sure.
And from the inside out, how do you have these more genuine partnerships that, as we say in the UN, we will need many hands to lift this burden.
So I'm wondering from your perspective, how can the UN help facilitate, for instance, advocacy of the Global South? So most of which, many countries in the Global South are the least offenders in terms of climate injustice or the contribution to climate change, and yet they need resources to help on so many of the sustainable development goals. How can the UN help support the Global South to do that kind of advocacy?
I mean, the greatest tool that we have is convening. And it's about convening the different sides on the aisle to get behind what is not just, it's also profitable. I mean, this is what we say, this is not a charity case, this is investment in people, and there are returns, for many things, for trade, for a better economy, for better lives. And this is the struggle that we have, is that, we are the only institution that can bring strange bedfellows together, and to put people in a room to try to find these solutions. So we do this with the Global South, but we do it with business, we do it with different governments, we do this with academia. The weekend before last, I had this is the greatest part about convening. You can convene on issues that are really important. And we had a convening on mental health in humanitarian settings. And such stigma to this. But if you know the kind of mental health issues that people are suffering from long after the conflict because of the atrocities that happen in conflict, and we just don't have the hands, or do we have even the curriculum for the kind of mental health that you need. Now, so we're discussing this together with many researchers and practitioners, and also psychosocial help we need in the field. It's that kind of convening that helps us get closer. The convening of the General Assembly that happens every year. This year, the Pact for the Future came up. What did we agree? That we needed to have an international financial architecture that would respond to the SDGs. We did have, agreements around financing for development in 2015, but it's always been that the architecture is not fit for purpose. We cannot access long-term concessional funding. When you have debt, there is no debt restructuring that will allow you to have a fiscal space to spend on health or education. So pushing all these questions with the constituencies that can take those positions, that can change that. Bringing in civil society. We've done less well with young people, but imagine 75 years later we actually have the office for youth. And the person that is there is a young person. I mean, people wonder why I'm saying that, but in my country, we have the my political party, the youth leader for us was like 65 years old. But we have a young man who is leading our youth office right now, and he's opened up a lot of space, not just for young people, but from the way that we approach a discussion with young people and bring them to the table. It's okay to have a position at the table, but do we even allow you a voice? And if you've got the voice, what happens after that? So it's about not ticking the box, but having you all the way through it. So I think that the convening around the issues which are predominantly in the global south are a continuous effort. And you have to innovate, you have to be more creative, you have to bring new people in all the time. Now we're using technology more. It's, I think, gets to a wider audience than we've ever had at all. What comes back, of course, is not always what you want to hear, but it's also, I think it's also a big wake-up call to the diversity of this world, the needs, the expectations, the way you're perceived. I mean, that's another thing, is not to stay in this little bubble of the UN thinking that we are just do-gooders. And to hear from the outside, often when the UN is criticized, the first thing you will hear is a defense. You go into knee-jerk, let me defend. You don't have to defend, you just have to listen. You might actually learn something and do it differently. And I think that's another aspect of bringing technology in and bringing young people in, is that we're beginning to see that we have to look in the mirror sometimes.
So you had a front row seat for some time about the impact of climate change. Can you tell us a positive and hopeful story? I'm just thinking we need it right now. About how something was solved, something got better, something specific.
Wow, okay. What got better? Well, we never thought we'd get a loss and damage fund in Cairo. First, the focus on Cairo and Egypt was human rights, wasn't even climate, because there were so many challenges there. And then came along recognizing that the damage that had been done continues to be done to our small island states. And this loss and damage fund being something long asked for. It happened really quickly. It in fact was the fastest that we'd ever set up a fund. And now doesn't have the resources that we need to respond, but at least it was a good beginning to see that people still believe that we needed a mechanism to respond to the challenges of small island states. There was another one when we finally got the government to put aside resources in my country to deal with the environment, in cleaning up the oil spills from the oil companies that provided, now livelihoods to men and women and communities. And that was really difficult. When I first went to the Niger Delta, the water, the soil, everything smelled of petroleum. And to clean up, you literally have to wash the sand. And you can imagine tons and tons of that. But to start that process, to clean up the creeks, to give people a future that perhaps they never thought that they would have, just from that small space, which we knew had to go much further. But that starting that is incredible, and to see how that's benefited many women and communities was also another good story. I don't think we should walk away from the Paris Agreement. That was also another incredible feat. We were all there, and the pushback against many of those issues, of course, we're not living up to the commitments that we made, but to have that there, that's something you can fight for. That's a good thing, and I think that the SDGs and the Paris Agreement are good tools that we should put to use.
I'm wondering how you think about putting them to use, just to pursue this. There are lots of different ways. There's encouraging states, there's sort of shaming states to live up to the commitments that they've made, and the convening, the sort of celebration of we are all on the same page. That's part of it, I gather.
It depends who you're talking to. I mean, we thought we'd think about your grandchild, because that's the future that matters, and you think that would tug at some heartstrings. And I said that to a businessman in one of our convenings, and he said to me, I really have to tell you the truth, I've got a trust fund for my grandchild, so it's not going to pull my strings. So a big wake-up call for me, because not everyone responds to that. way they're wired. And I think that what it taught me is to meet people where they're at and try and bring them to where you need to bring them. And many of these businessmen did come to our side because we started to say, so, okay, so what makes up that transition for you in your company going green? What are the issues that you would need to attend to, and how could that affect, the jobs and the investments that you make in our countries? You begin to have a conversation, and then you get closer to it. But it is not easy. I mean, every conversation we have is different, and the world is so very different. What you need in Africa is different from the six, the small and developing states, different from places in Asia, and you really do have to get a picture of that. Data is a big problem for us. We don't have, in the aggregates, the figure of 17% towards the SDGs is an aggregate sum. This aggregate, we don't know. All these years later, not able to have baseline data is a big problem for many communities. So when we say we leave no one behind, we don't actually know where the no ones are. And you're trying to figure out, which of these communities, indigenous people, people with disabilities, LGBTQI, where are they all? And you have to try to still figure that out with what we're doing. But there are, for instance, now we try to clarify it a bit better at the country level and with donors. But if we focus on 6 areas of investment, the first 3 are interconnected, so it helps us to deal with the SDG agenda that is about 3 strands of sustainable development. And that is to do food systems. Everybody understands food systems from production to the table. It's a huge ecosystem. But with developing countries, unless you can power it, and that means off-grid, because the local communities are not on grid, don't have power. So again, this gives you an opportunity for green solutions and green energy. So power the food systems and then connect them to markets, women having their financial services online for the first time, they can protect their resources. Extension work, you don't have to come to university, we'll have the apps that will help you in the field. Suddenly you've got produce, okay, how do I get to market? Online. Suddenly you're marketing these goods. The thing is happening in communities that have never had access before. So we say these are 3 important investment opportunities. Big business likes that, at scale, it's profitable. Then the other 3 areas are softer issues. First, saying that the environment is one in which climate is a big issue. The second is education. Education will be different going forward, but how do we at least deal with the skills that you need to connect to market? So that you're going into school, coming out with a skill set that can get you a job, you can create a job, that you are able to pursue your path. And then last but not least, for those that are falling through the cracks, that social protection for is really important. So to rethink financial instruments like insurance, which forever and a day has been health, but why can it not be education? And people say, well, how do you do that? Well, you did health, you can do this. It really requires us to just become a little bit more genius about how to find those solutions. So that set of 6 investments is one that we push for people to become more engaged and connected to the possibilities of investment and what it means for people, for jobs, for changing the economies. But we also know that in many of our countries, we don't have a number of skill sets that we need even in this economy. We are short of those that will help us with policy and regulatory environment. This is expensive, it takes time, it's complex. We're short of people who know how to design for scale. We're very happy at doing the small projects at schools, small health clinics. That's not going to help you get to scale. I've got 240 million people in Nigeria. A project for 1 million is not going to make a difference. So designing the scale that would attract the investors to come in. And then the other 2 are, looking at the financial mix that you need. Yes, you need domestic resources. They will always be resources that are sustainable. But you need to attract foreign direct investment and others to come into it. And I'll go full circle around to all 16 strong institutions. You cannot deliver on services, you cannot deliver sustain some of these investments without having capacity in your governments, in local governments and communities, civil society.
Speaking of governments, I'm sure you're aware that the United States had a national election recently. And I know you don't want to comment on the outcome of that election, but I'm
host to the United Nations. That for them should be their oyster and their gateway to diplomacy and the world, because that's where it all comes. I mean, no matter what the US does, it will not convene 193 countries, maybe 50, 60 at best. And we do it in the UN, and this is in your backyard, so use it. I think that's really important. Don't give up on it. If there are things that it's doing that you don't, I mean, we all feel we can make it better. And I think that's what we need to do, is to engage with that. I mean, the election that happened in this country, I think was a big wake-up call. This is not a small number of people that voted for President Trump. And it went through everything from your popular votes to your senators, to your governors, to your house, and it was everything, this look at that. And for us, looking at it from the international community, and perhaps even my country, would be to ask the question, okay, so what next? Why did this happen? Whose perceptions were they of a country that was, are you divided or, in fact, closer together than you ever imagined? And, leadership, what does that mean? And we have these perceptions of leadership that should fit this box. And when it doesn't, it's really difficult for us to deal with, and we put it into another box. So it's either good or it's not good. And then you perhaps don't find the places that you can engage with. And I'll say this because in Africa, for many, many decades, everybody told us we had bad leadership. Leadership didn't do this, and didn't do that, and didn't do the other. So now in the world, there's no monopoly on that leadership. It is just leadership that, as I said earlier, we need to understand better how to make it function for the people. Does it deliver? There are many different ways to deliver, but we have democracy. We have a model that we all follow and that we have fed to the world. I think the values of democracy are sacrosanct, and I think we should hold on to them and protect them. But perhaps we ought to start questioning the model. Does it work for everyone? Does it deliver for people? It can't always be that, well, we don't practice it, it doesn't function because we don't do what we're supposed to do. In many cases, you do. And I think that, for me, I find the struggle, I can talk about my country because I don't talk about other countries, but I talk about mine. I mean, democracy for us is very expensive. It's expensive because the parliament and government is there, and really high salaries, and it is expensive. It's also short term. Whichever country in 4 years, even the World Bank doesn't get through a project in 4 years. So when you're thinking about building from nothing to developing a country, having sometimes long-term trajectories would help. So it's expensive, it's short-term, and unfortunately the governments, the way and manner in which we have these election cycles, with no systems in place for the day after you fall out of office, therefore gives you huge problems, challenges in laws we have democracy.
I thought that we would just have a moment for a couple of student questions, and a number of them were submitted in advance. Michael is a Brooklyn College student and says, as a proud Brooklyn College graduate student and former UN Secretariat staffer, welcome to our campus. What do you consider the future of the role of citizen and public diplomacy in our colleges and universities in light of Sustainable Development Goals 16 and 17?
That's a UN question. I think that, the discourse between what we see in citadels of learning and what we see in real life, in the practice of diplomacy, is very different. And I think there needs to be a better interaction between the two. I'm having a conversation like this with you, but when I left Nigeria, I came to teach at Columbia. And when they asked me to design this course, what I did was from policy to practice. Because I felt like the practice of what it is that we do and intend to achieve stayed very firmly in the domain of what we were learning and continuing to learn. And when you go into the UN, you find that the disconnect is so much process, so much about what the learning was, and reinforcing it with you in academia, and not getting out into pushing it out the door to implement it.
So theory versus practice.
It's a huge problem. It's a huge problem. It's a huge problem. And I think that one needs to see that feedback loop for more interaction with practitioners at the local level. I went into the UN feeling all the time like I had to have the answer. And I was thinking, this is not a class. This is real life. And some of those answers are not there, but what we're supposed to co-create here. And with people in the field, and come back and listen a little more. I mean, if I hear anything from my country teams when I go to the field, it's could you just do a little less process and understand that we're here dealing with what we would say in New York, or, can you please figure out the nexus between humanitarian development and climate? And they're looking at you like, what are you talking about? This thing just happens, and this is it is on the ground. It doesn't fit in. It does not fit into that. You can say, have the practice and bring it back into how you explain it, and then back again. So I think there's a big disconnect between what it is that we say we are trying to achieve and what we do.
So this is a question that circles back to where you began your talk. It's from Sabera Chaudhry from the class of 23. Considering that only 17% of the Sustainable Development Goals are on track, with just 6 years left until the 2030 deadline, how should businesses prioritize their efforts? It's interesting that the question is about businesses. I'm also just thinking, how do we collectively, in the public sector and the private sector, how should we address this issue?
I think we're all a part of it. I mean, whether you find yourself in business or you find yourself in government or otherwise, is to look at that business and to see how sustainable it is. And we talk about circular economy, but we also talk about greening your business. We have got big asks of industry right now, from cement to steel to shipping. So these are all businesses that need to rethink their business model with what it will take to use less fossil fuel than they are today. That has challenges. I mean, in the short term, there will be a cost, but in the longer term, you'll be on the right side of history. You need to, I think, find incentives for that. You need to have a narrative that doesn't say, well, because this cement industry goes green today, that will create jobs or you will lose jobs. It's the whole ecosystem of what that cement industry plugs and plays, and then that will give us far more. So, yeah, I think that we are speaking to many industries, many businesses. The food industry, as I said, is very different. Map out what it is and what is moving in your space of the world, and how do you want that to transition. The market has a great role to play with this as well. We're talking about sustainability, and I think it's very difficult for us to look at people who can't see tomorrow's meal, try to engage them in conversations sustainably.
And when you think about your legacy, what your legacy is?
Well, I think that, for me coming to the UN was to try to make sure that I left it better than I met it. I can say today, if I left this today, we have half of the management of the United Nations are women and not people. Half of those resident coordinators that sit in 130 countries, engaging with government communities to get the work done. Half that leadership is also women. I think that we put on the agenda many issues that were not there when we came, like mental health. We've not solved the problem of Haiti, but that was one country that we put up front and thought this is conspicuous. The 2011 was of course 2017, and this is the problem with this 2024 is still a big issue. I think we've given far more visibility to many areas that we would not otherwise have done in climate to show what you can do to try to get to that. We've created many convenings to do better at what we do. So not enough. And I will leave the place, feeling that was so much undone. But I think I will feel satisfied that given this privilege in this time